welcome to this new Tech Captains episode. So this week with Gareth, we welcome Laura Burnett, who has been working in tech for many years. Laura is currently head of delivery at Mate Tech. We'll come to it in a few seconds, making sure technical projects are being delivered in time and according to requirements. But Laura, how are you today?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So Laura, you currently work at Mate Tech, as I just mentioned. It's an organization of almost 400 people, according to LinkedIn at least, building tech solutions for the public sector, such as the Ministry of Justice, the National Health Service, and so forth. So I'll go directly to the core with you. Like, we usually have very technical people in the call, in the podcast as guests, and what, how would you explain your job to an 8-year-old?
Oh, good question. So, as you said, MadeTech are sort of delivering services to the public sector, which I think is a really great place to be. It means that the work that we do and the solutions we build are generally working towards the good of the of the public, and it's things that I might use or you might use. So that's really sort of really nice to work on. My role specifically, or sort of as a delivery manager, was very much focused on making sure that our teams have everything they need in order to sort of surprise and delight our clients and also the end users, which is obviously citizens in this scenario. So that might be unblocking things, removing dependencies, or it might be helping a client to really understand how they deliver on a need that is that they have.
So would you say you're a project manager or you more than that?
Yeah, I think it's sort of the cross between project manager and scrum master. So working towards the uh, working with a little bit more budget and constraints than a pure play sort of
Yeah,
scrum and agile environment may always have, but very much using the principles of agile and iterative development and lean practices and user-centered design practices to constantly review and adapt as we're developing.
I see. And how did you end up in such a role? Because your background is in microbiology, pathology, pharmacology. Like, how did you end up working in tech companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as you say, I did a degree in microbiology, and my first job after graduating, I worked for a scientific publisher. It was all online, and I started off kind of writing articles and working with their marketing customers to sort of develop the advertising that we had on the website. But from speaking to the customers and then also the website users, started to identify things that could be improved on the website, and so either services that we didn't have or services that could be better. So I then became involved with the IT department and started to look at ways that we could better serve the needs of our customers. Um, Moved into project management in that way. And I must admit, my first foray into project management, I used to write these really long briefs, really
Yeah,
detailed specifications up front, get the IT team to give me a quote of how long it would take, force them to shorten their quote, and then hold them to account when they didn't deliver it. When I learned about agile and moved into that, it was a massive game changer.
So, and you've worked in the public and the private sector, right? So, what would you say? What are the
hmm
big differences between projects that you've worked on in the public versus the private sector?
I think for me, it's actually a lot more progressive than people may automatically assume, and by that I mean um, agile development is very much baked into the government digital services um, a service manual, which is how all digital products are supposed to be developed. All teams are cross-functional and will include user-centered design expertise within the team. So it means that our engineers will sit on user research sessions. They will have a real in-depth understanding of the user needs that we're trying to deliver to and how that aligns to the wider strategy of the product. And I think for me, that's what I love about it. When I used to work with private sector clients in another agency, we'd often get designs thrown over the fence. Perhaps the design work would have been done by a completely different agency. We'd never see the user research side of it. It was just purely, okay, here's this thing, go away and build it. So seeing the impact of that, I think, is kind of why I get up in the morning.
I would never have expected you to say that the UK government is mandating really good practices like that. That's great. That's really good.
And in terms of like your interaction with the developers, like how does that work? Because obviously, every stereotype comes from somewhere. And I mean, I'm a developer myself, and like the interactions between the devs and the non-technical persons can sometimes be difficult because you don't speak the same language and your priorities are not necessarily the same. And it's like the all-time joke that a developer never know can never give an estimate on when it will be done, right? Because there's too many uncertain factors, but you can't give that to the client. So how do you deal with all of this?
Yeah, so I think I see my role as very much protecting the team, and that might be both the developers and then also the non-development team. So, holding external pressures from the business on delivery dates and can you commit to delivering something by now, away from the team, but at the same time, I do think it's important to have team accountability. So the whole team is committed to we we're working toward like an example might be sometimes working in public sector you may be working towards a date which has been committed to by a ministerial deadline. There's something in legislation that means that we have to get a service live
Yeah.
in a certain time, so then making sure that the wider team understands what that driver is so that we're working towards it as a collective team. But then we're on the iron triangle. If the dates are fixed, it's the scope that you might be looking at changing and having open conversations about do we have the right team shape in place? Is there anything else that we need as a team? How can we sustainably meet the commitments that we've made, but without burning out and working
Yeah.
all hours of the
It's
day?
interesting what you said about you feel that you're sort of protective of the team, and I think because I've worked with traditional project managers, and recently it's all been delivery managers, and I think it's interesting to see how you're very much more involved day to day, hour by hour with what the team's doing, making sure they have what they need. It is a very different kind of relationship, isn't it, than what it used to be?
Definitely. And sort of my background, I've got a little bit of product and almost like business analysis as well. So I'm quite a curious person. I like to understand, the way that we're delivering things. And I've always been I've always had the ethos of asking questions, even if my natural inclination is, oh well, that's probably a technical question. This might be a really stupid thing to ask. Everyone else on the conversation is going to know the answer, what this acronym is, because I found that by doing that, actually there might be somebody else in the room who isn't really sure on what it is. And I've had associate engineers go, I'm really glad you asked that. I felt too embarrassed to ask, but I didn't know what that thing is either. So I think that
Right.
because I'm quite curious, I like to understand what it is, but it allows me to help with those conversations with
Yeah. So your
clients.
science background is quite helpful there, really, isn't it? That
Yeah,
curiosity, I
definitely.
suppose.
I think there are a lot of similarities between that sort of way of thinking.
So if you had to like looking back at your career and everything that you've done and the decision you made or the things that happen because they happen without necessarily a conscious decision, like what advice you would give to younger people or older people entering into the tech industry?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back a little bit in history, but I went to an all-girls school, and at that school, we weren't offered IT as an option at GCSE. They decided that girls didn't really need to know that much about IT, and I'm not that old.
Wow.
It's not that long ago in history, so I never even knew that computer science or IT was a career path in itself. And I think I was quite lucky that I've fallen into it. So I, if I had my time again, would probably have done a computer science degree, gone down that path earlier. I found it something that I really enjoy. But um, so I think my advice, particularly to young women and girls, is just about exploring what is out there and understanding the sort of um, the IT and software development is a career that's open to everybody, not just to sort of to men.
But that's interesting what you say, and you bring in that topic. So I'll jump on it. And that, why do you think there's less women in tech? Like, I did a computer science course at university, and there were maybe 5 to 10%, girls in the class. So obviously, later on for companies, it's very hard to hire women because there's just not enough. So it's just the top of the funnel is empty. It's dry. The source is dry. So like, how do you get more people interested at the beginning to choose that as a career path when they're young? You mentioned school, what you had. Do you think it's still the case today that the schools are still blocking girls to get interested into that kind of career, or you think there's something larger at play?
I I would assume that you wouldn't have the same experience that I did, where it wasn't even an option.
Yeah.
I think there is a much wider focus on STEM careers and women in technology. So I would hope that that isn't the case anymore. But I think, there are still quite traditional values that sometimes are kind of brought up. And I think it's still, I obviously don't know any actual statistics, but I think it's still the case that women are much more likely to end up in caring and nurturing careers, and engineering and sort of more science focused and technology based careers are seen as more masculine. So I think there's that education piece to do from an early age. Things like having more computer games that appeal to young girls as well as young boys, for example. I think there's things there that can be done. And then I think, people like myself is actually getting into schools, talking to young people, explaining the opportunities that are there. And then from an employer's perspective, um, looking at things that can be done. So at MadeTech, we have an apprenticeship scheme. It was previously an academy. We're now launching it as an apprenticeship. And we've been like historically that has been about 50-50 split. So it's a really
Yeah.
good way of us bringing in grassroots and helping with diversity at that level, not always recruiting from people who have a more traditional computer science background, but looking at other avenues to sort of develop our own talent. And then, the other thing is looking at continued coaching and mentoring, perhaps when um, if a woman has a career break to go and have children, for example, what can be done to allow them to re-enter. I know that technology careers and engineering careers require an awful lot of self-study, upskilling, keeping on top of the latest developments in technology. And if an employer can provide time for that learning and development within the working day, then that reduces the risk of young mums falling behind
Mm-hmm.
because they can't do as much of that study, for example. So I think
Yeah.
there's lots that can be done.
It's interesting. You're the third woman we've had on this podcast, and we've got into the topic like Ron just asked you the question about, why aren't there more women in tech? And I'm actually gobsmacked that at a girls' school which doesn't sound, it was an awfully long time ago because you're not that old, Laura. They weren't even offering that. That's amazing to me. The apprenticeship scheme your company has, I don't know if you can you tell people for the podcast, is there where they can go if they're interested in joining that?
Oh, good question. I think the best option to do is to go to the Maytech website, and I think there's a link to sign up there when we next sort of release the next cohort. So yeah.
Uh, And Laura, so we have a small tradition in the podcast that the guest introduces a book that they really liked. So you sent in advance a few books, so you seem to be an avid reader. And the one we've selected from your list is Product Roadmaps, which was a relaunch, you said, by Todd Lombardo, and the Product Roadmap relaunched by Todd Lombardo, among others. And it's about how to set direction while embracing uncertainty. So I'm very interested in this book. Like, what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so I mentioned before that I've got sort of a bit of interest in product and sort of product thinking as well. And I think this this book is much more aligned to the outcome, sort of outcome focused development. So thinking about, rather than being feature led, and you might say, okay, I'm running my website and I want you, Mr. Um, developer, to go and put a button on this website. Actually, it's not the button that you want. You want more clicks. You want people to go through to whatever the page is that the button's focused. So that would be an example of, like, the outcome you want is more clicks. The button is the feature. And I think traditionally, you'd see these big Gantt charts and waterfall delivery plans that had a lot of dependencies on. And this book is more about focusing on outcomes, considering the cone of uncertainty that you might have. So actually, the further away you get, the less certain you are on the work. So having a wider planning frame, the further away you go. And there's a lot of really helpful practical tools about different approaches to prioritization, for example, or how you can validate that the features that you want to develop will help you meet the strategic objective that you're working towards. So I find it a really helpful book for helping you to turn an overall company strategy and priorities into tangible tasks that we can deliver as a development team.
Yeah, so one of the things I noticed on the website, that you mentioned that you have a focus on helping the public sector modernize legacy tech, which I'm sure is a, well, almost never ending job, right? But from a delivery perspective, what do you think the hardest thing is about replacing older tech?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. I think,
I mean, do these, okay, maybe I'll add a bit more info. Do you tend to be doing more wholesale replacement, or is it more piecemeal? Because I'm guessing there might be some really big systems involved, right?
yeah, um, I think that yeah, definitely there's a bit of a mix as to whether you need to replace an entire solution or not. I think a lot of the work we've done, particularly in local government, is to help them sort of move away from these big, expensive sort of SaaS solutions that they get really locked into, and the prices go up and up, and what they get for it is just atrocious. And instead, starting to move to a model where they can have like an open source platform that they can run themselves, and sort of do so for in a much more efficient way when it comes to sort of taxpayer and local authority budgets. And I think from a delivery perspective, understanding how much of it needs to be migrated is often a bit of a challenge. Do you need a like for like replacement? Are there some features and functionality which you use more than others? are there further user needs that could be being met if we architected something in a different way? So I think there's lots of questions that we can ask about the right strategy and approach as we sort of move into a legacy tech replacement project.
And are you seeing, so you mentioned open source, are you seeing then a lot of movement, I'm guessing in the UK, I don't know if you work outside the UK as well, are you seeing a lot of movement away from legacy to open source in the public sector?
We only currently work with UK based
Okay.
companies. Only work in the UK, but again on the GDS service manual, open source technology and considering open source is one of the key practices of
Hmm.
sort of the service manual. But that being said, there are still times when it makes more sense to procure something off the shelf, and you don't always want to develop something just for the sake of it. And not all public sector departments have the budget to have an internal development team running every single service and product that they might want. So, a lot of the digital transformation strategy work we do is actually looking at, those buy versus build
Hmm.
considerations, and actually what is the right approach for the client in that scenario.
And as Ron mentioned, he and I are both CTOs, so we work with delivery people. And I wonder, from your perspective, what do you think that senior tech leaders don't really understand correctly about what you do? What is the what are the misconceptions, do you think?
Oh, I'm not sure I've necessarily come up against that much kind of conflict or misconception. I can't think of anything. Sorry.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. I mean, that's good then. I mean, I guess it means that we're kind of we're sort of in tune. I think maybe perhaps in tech leaders now with sort of more modern delivery practices. So it sounds like it's working quite well. And I guess the last question I would ask is, so I think you scaled agile. I'd never even heard of scaled agile until I came to work at the company I'm at now. What are the big differences between scaled and regular agile for people who don't know?
I think if you can organize your technical teams um, into product teams where each product team owns the end-to-end delivery and they can manage the front end, the back end, the getting the service live. I think that is um, always a great sort of direction of travel to have as an organization, because it really empowers those teams. But in reality, that isn't always feasible, or at least feasible in the immediate sense. And so you may have another department which is doing integration and testing, and perhaps you've got a security or a DevOps team who manage the infrastructure and the permissions that you have set up in your environment. And I think when you start to get these levels of complexity at enterprise level organizations, and you're thinking about how those teams call upon those central resources and sort of manage those dependencies, then that's where you start to think about how you may have to scale agile and sort of agile ways of working. Obviously, there's quite a lot of specific frameworks that can be used, and there's also an awful lot of noise, challenge, friction that goes on in the agile community around, are scaled agile frameworks actually agile or not? But I think the key thing for me is about having shared backlogs and visibility so that anyone at any time can see, what's the overarching picture that we're working towards versus that of my team, being able to have the right meetings and sessions in place to think about, sharing those blockers and dependencies and having those conversations, and, almost designing a solution that works for your organization to help the team sort of streamline and go fast but still deliver the right level of
So it
value.
sounds like, in a way, it's probably something that's it becomes more suitable as the organization becomes more complex, doesn't it? Really, and there's more, yeah, more people involved.
Yeah, and I would still, at an organizational level, and perhaps this is where you as a CTO come in, still be asking questions about, can we simplify things further? Do we really need to scale agile, or can we can we put more of this ownership into the development teams so that they can manage those products and services end to end?
That makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, thank you, Laura. I mean, it's very interesting, and I'm quite pleased we have our first non-technical and head of delivery. I didn't know about this role before, to be honest. So it's even more interesting for me. Gareth knew about it. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, and for everybody listening, we will be back in 2 weeks. Bye bye.